How did the United States commence their first land offensive, littoral maneuver no less, in the Second World War? We look at US Marines on Tulagi 1942, the forgotten first US offensive of the Second World War.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the podcast. Very excited to have Dave Holland back with us today. We are continuing our Guadalcanal campaign series. Dave is a battlefield guide with extensive experience around Guadalcanal. He's got encyclopedic knowledge of the Guadalcanal land campaign, and he is the author of Guadalcanal's Longest Fight. Today we're talking about Tulagi, Tanambogo, and Gavutu Islands. Let's get back to the discussion, the Marines' first combat landing of the Second World War. Welcome back to the podcast, Dave.
Thanks, James. It's great to be back, and I'm ready for episode 2. So now we're actually getting into some fighting.
Absolutely. So we're going to look at Tulagi. The Marines left Wellington on the 22nd of July, 1942. That's the same day as the Japanese landing at Buna and Gona. The task force was to conduct landings on 5 islands: Florida, Gavutu, Tanambogo, Tulagi, and Guadalcanal. How well prepared were they when they left Wellington?
Okay, I think it goes back to the last episode when I was talking about the, composition and the training and the experience or non-experience of the division. I think I said in the last episode they're fairly green. In fact, I'd say 70% to 80% of the division was very green. And so their planning was 3 to 4 weeks, or I think extended out to at least the 7th from the 1st. They got a reprieve for another week. King gave them another week for the 7th. So the plan was only 5 weeks. So Operation Watchtower became Operation Shoestring, which was the joke at the time. It was a shoestring invasion. So I guess, as you could say, in 5 weeks, launching the largest U.S. amphibious assault in their history at that stage was probably the best they could be within 5 weeks training and 5-week preparation. So they weren't that well prepared, but they had to do what they had to do. They had to make the best of a bad situation. Luckily, I think I spoke about in the last episode, they had some good quality officers and some good NCOs, and they had a high quality of the green recruits. I think I said, too, also that of these recruits, one also said they're all officers. If they were in peacetime, they'd be officer caliber because of volunteers, and these are the bunch that came straight out of the Pearl Harbors. They're very well motivated. They were keen to take on the Japanese. And they're very motivated and dedicated, so to speak, ready to go.
Now, on the way to Guadalcanal, they stopped at Koro Island in Fiji for 2 rehearsal landings. How did they go?
Well, I think it's kind of common knowledge that it was a fiasco, a complete fiasco. That was what Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Twining, one of the division plane officers, said. It was a complete fiasco. But in a lot of books and a lot of accounts, they just write it off as nothing was learned. But there were some valuable lessons learned from this. I guess some of the things that they dubbed it to be a complete fiasco, the reasons were a lot of the boats were hung up on the Koro. So Koro is about 400 miles south of Fiji. That was the rendezvous place. And there was also the rendezvous or the meeting place for the whole fleet. So you had Admiral Fletcher, you had Admiral Kerner and the transport units. You had them all meeting at one stage. This is the first time that the 3 elements were meeting all together. So it was also a chance to do rehearsals, but also a chance to have the actual first conference with the tactical commander, which was Admiral Fletcher at the time. So we can all talk about that in a second. But when they actually did the dress rehearsals, a lot of the boats were hung up on Coral. They landed like 100 or 200 yards off. They swamped a lot of the boats, ran into their own beaches, landed on their own beaches. Some of the guys going down the ladders and the ropes got hung up. Equipment fell in the ocean. Yeah, it was a complete fiasco. But things cons, you could say. It was the first time for a lot of the smaller units to have meetings. So they coordinated a lot of stuff. Some of the air and the naval coordinated the timings with the firing and how they worked together. The boat timings were worked out. It allowed them a chance to repack and continue packing some of their gear because as you know, and we discussed in the last episode, when they landed in New Zealand under Operation Longwolf for the 6-month deployment there, they're all admin packed in the cargo ships. So they had to do a rush repack the best they could to combat load those ships. So it gave them a chance to continue that combat loading. So there was some lessons learned from it and some good things from it. But overall, it didn't fill them with optimism. Now, the conference was on the 26th of July. So that was Fletcher. He was meeting with Turner, who was the amphibious force commander. Vandergrift was the 1st Marine Division commander, and a guy called Rear Admiral Callahan. So he was the chief of staff for Rear Admiral, or Vice Admiral Gormley, who was the South Pacific commander. Interestingly, Gormley didn't attend. He was still back in this stage. I think he'd moved his headquarters to New Caledonia, I think at that stage, or potentially New Zealand, but he was one of those two places. I think he'd forward deployed to New Caledonia, but he wasn't there. So Fletcher wasn't really convinced about the invasion. Vandergrift said that Fletcher had he was of the opinion that Fletcher thought of it more of a raid, amphibious raid in and out, not of we're going to go there and stay. Obviously, he had 3 carriers, and he was very protective of his carriers. So the debate was, how long was the air cover going to remain to unload the transports and cargo ships? So it's a big controversy even today. So Fletcher says, I'll give you D+1, so D-Day, landing day +1, so 2 days of air coverage, then I'm out of there. Because he didn't want to keep his carriers on station in a stationary position because they're susceptible to especially land-based bombers, and he wanted to keep them on the move. So Turner and Vandergrift wasn't keen or wasn't happy with that idea. They said, well, there's no way. They expect at least 4 to 5 days to unload those cargoes and transports. I mean, to unload a transport ship's not, you got men on it. You can unload them quite quickly. But all the cargo is going to take a number of days. So they said, look, 4 to 5 days. Fletcher goes, they went back and forth. Finally, Fletcher said, okay, I'll give you D+2. So 3 days. And that's it. I'm out of there on the 9th of August. I'm out of there. Now, Callahan, who was supposed to be Gormley's representative, didn't say a word. He was just kind of acting as a scribe. He wrote notes down. So if Gormley would have been there, at least he would have been, I guess, the person who could mediate it and made the final decision. But he wasn't there. And that's a big controversy. And so they left the conference. Vandergrift and Turner wasn't too happy because they said, we only got 3 days. Fletcher wasn't really happy because I don't think he really wanted to command the expedition to start with. So what Turner had come up with, he said, this is our plan. It's going to take us at least 4 to 5 days to unload these cargo ships. So we have a covering force of cruisers, heavy cruisers, and some destroyers under a guy called Admiral Crutchley, who was a British admiral, actually Victoria Cross. He'd been awarded the Victoria Cross, I think, in the First World War. So he was on loan to the Australian Navy. He commanded, his flagship was the HMAS. I said HMS once, and someone basically flogged me on the podcast I was on, or I think on Facebook. HMAS, get my accent right, Australia. And also the Canberra there, and I think there was a cruiser, I can't think off the top of my head, you might know it, but there was 3 Australian ships involved. So they're part of the covering force. And what they were going to do is, he was going to use those covering force of heavy cruisers and some destroyer pickets. And then they were going to provide protection to the cargo ships get offloaded. This becomes very important a bit later on when we get to talk about the Battle of Savoy. This really comes into very importance there. So that was the plan. And after that, they proceeded on to do the invasion. And at this stage, most of the Marines didn't know they were going to invade Guadalcanal. I think it was actually right before Koro or at Koro that most of the Marines were just learning, okay, invasion is Guadalcanal. Even though you read some accounts or hear some accounts that it was already known. But generally, when you read most of the enlisted men and the private soldiers' accounts or Marines' accounts, they didn't know where they were going. They just knew they were going into combat. In fact, the cover story the division came up with the troops was, we're packing very quickly. We're going to go do some exercises and some training. But some of the old NCOs and some of the officers started realizing when the live ammunition started coming out, we're not going to do training. We're going into combat somewhere. So that was the coverage story when they left. So after the Koro was finished, conference, when they started heading basically north, the word got out. Rudimentary maps, didn't have good maps, came out, we're going to Guadalcanal. And they started working out the plans.
So leading the landing at Tulagi was Brigadier General William Rupertus. He's second in command under Major General Alexander Vandergrift. What was Rupertus like?
Yeah, so it's Rupertus. Some people say Rupertus, but it's mainly Rupertus. So William Rupertus was a career Marine. Initially, he came in I think it was the revenue service, but what's called modern today, the Coast Guard. And for medical residency, he didn't make it to the academy, so he received a commission in Marine Corps. So he was an excellent marksman, competition shooter. He was the author of the Marines. Well, all Marines know it's called the Rifleman's Creed. There are many rifles, but this one was mine. And Marines still say it to this day in boot camp. But yeah, he was known as a great staff officer, very smart fellow. I think he graduated #1 in his class. He'd served in the quote banana wars, but I think it's more administrative type roles in Haiti. And then he served in China. He was a part of China Marines. He commanded a battalion in the 4th Marines, which is 4th Marine Regiment in China. So he was 37, 38, around that time, he had an opportunity to observe the Chinese. Because as you know, that was when the Sino-Japanese War was kicking off for the second time. So he was in Shanghai, and he got to observe. I'm pretty sure he was in Shanghai. Yeah, I think they were. But anyway, he got to observe his future enemies and how they fought. So he was the division's assistant division commander. So he was friends with Vandegrift, the division commander. And he later became very controversial because he was the 1st Marine Division commander to Battle of Peleliu. And that's where there's a lot of controversy around that battle. And he was the division commander there. So a lot of controversy follows Rupertus. In my opinion, Rupertus was a great staff officer. He wasn't really known to be a frontline combat officer, say like a Puller or Edson, or even a Vandegrift. He wasn't very personable. He didn't like to visit the guys on the lines and things like that. But I think he's shown in his planning and his staff officer capability. He's a very smart planner. So in this battle, I think we'll get to it a bit later, but they divided the forces in the 2 forces, one under Rupertus and one under Vandegrift. So Vandegrift had Task Force X-Ray, and they went to Guadalcanal, and Rupertus had Task Force Yoke, XY, and they speared north to go to Tulagi and the surrounding islands. So it was basically 2 separate battles, unsupported, fought at the same time.
So what's the terrain like in Tulagi?
Well, see, Tulagi was the British pre-war colonial capital. So the British Solomon Islands, I think from 1896, was a British protectorate. So they administered and ran the whole Solomon Islands. So they established their headquarters on Tulagi. Now, the reason they did that, Tulagi is a nice little island. It's basically free from some of the tropical diseases and away from the mainlands and the swamps and things like that. It's a good place to establish. Plus, Tulagi Harbor is one of the best deep water ports, I've been told, in the Pacific, but definitely in the South Pacific. So it's a very strategic area. So Tulagi is about 4,000 yards long, roughly about 1,000 yards wide. During the time of the battle, most of it had been cleared because the British had established their headquarters there. It's what you would think of a pre-war British outpost. It had a cricket pitch, had a 9-hole golf course. It had a giant country club, nice, neat lined streets with colonial administration buildings, had a prison, had a hospital. So it was a very well-maintained area. And most of the vegetation had been cut loose. On the northern bit, there's a mango swamp, and that was probably the thickest part. Running down the island was or still is what I keep saying was. I was only there 3 weeks ago. Is a mountainous spine. I won't say mountain, it's a hill spine. So the highest peak, it ends at the southern bit of the island on a hill called 281. So it's 281 feet. That's what they designated it as. So that was where the highest point was 281. But that's hill spine ran the whole length. Toward the southern bit, the British had cut a path, about a normal road width, through the ridge. So they're allowed to one side to go from the government buildings to the living quarters. So they call it the cut, which in the Battle of Tulagi comes of importance. So that's what Tulagi was. It was actually a very nice area. It still is, but it was super nice in 1942.
Yeah, it's unusual being in the Solomons and seeing a cricket ground.
Yeah, cricket pitch, yes. Yeah, I've got Martin Clemens, who was the famous coast watcher. I've got a photo from his private album, and it shows the cricket pitch in 1938. And it looks just like you're in Australia somewhere. And I think when you went there, you seen the cricket pitch. For American listeners, that's like the concrete long. You explain it, James. How would you explain a cricket pitch? What is that?
It's the oval is an oval shape. That's the playing ground where you play the cricket. And there's a pitch where the bowling and the batting happen. So that's where most of the action occurs. And so someone bowls a ball and the batsman at the other end tries to hit it as far and as fast as he can. And then they run in between the wickets.
How long do you think a pitch is?
10, 15 metres, I think. Not sure. But yeah. It's not a huge distance.
Yeah, and this one was made of concrete. It's still there, as you know.
Yep.
So, anyway, that's all we got. Tulagi Blue.
So the first landing of the Guadalcanal campaign, and so this is the commencement of US land offensive for the Second World War, was at Tulagi. How did that landing go?
Actually, it was at Haleta, which was a few hundred yards from Tulagi. That's one of the things, and a lot of people forget or don't even realize, the 2nd Marines. So when I say 2nd Marines, in the Marine Corps, they pronounce their regiments by Marines. Say 1st Marines, 2nd Marines, 3rd Marines. That means regiment. So they want to say division, it's 1st Marine Division. Sometimes that's confusing to people. So the 2nd Marines was part of Task Force Yoke. And they were going to be a reserve force only, because Turner had wanted to use them in reserve. And after the landings, he was going to take the whole regiment and send them to a place called Nadini, which is in the Santa Cruz Island. So it's between Espiritu Santo and Guadalcanal. They were going to grab Nadini. So Ndeni, Ndeni. So that was the idea. So I think we discussed on last episode how the 7th Marines, which is one of the 3rd Rifle Regiments of the division, had been earmarked and sent previously in April and May in 42 to Samoa. So they're garrisoned Samoa. So it left Vandegrift without a rifle regiment. So he was down to 2 rifle regiments. So the 2nd Marines was on loan temporarily for this initial invasion. Then they were going to shoot off in Ndeni. So part of their job, B Company, 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, was to land to the west of Tulagi, about 500 yards in the Florida Islands, because Tulagi's only separated for like 400 or 500 yards from the Florida Islands, which is a large island group. But on the tip, overlooking the beach that the Marines were going to land on, Tulagi, was a small village called Haleta. So they thought, well, if there's any Japanese at Haleta, they could pour enfilading fire straight on Blue Beach, which is the Tulagi landed beach. Therefore, 20 minutes earlier, we're going to land a company of Marines on Haleta to secure that village, to ensure protect the left flank of the raiders landed on Tulagi. So at 0740 or 7:40 a.m. on the morning of the 7th of August, B Company, 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, and Captain Crane landed. They were the first troops to land. Now, let's put an Australian spin on this. I think I mentioned in the previous episode that when Lieutenant Colonel, later Colonel, Getchy, the division intelligence officer, went to Australia, he spoke to a number of former planters and colonial officials and things like that that lived there, so he could gather intel. So he incorporated about, I think, 8 or 12 of these as guides. So one of the guides was a guy called, I always get this wrong, pilot officer, flying officer. I think it's flying officer. I get my Royal Australian ranks wrong sometimes. Anyway, it just says flying officer. Flying officer C. Spencer. Now, Spencer led those guys, because Spencer lived on Tulagi for a number of years, so he knew the area quite well. So he led those guys in. Now, the first man to put his foot on the soil was an Australian, Spencer.
Oh,
wow. A lot of people don't. Yeah. So I've got Spencer's unpublished memoirs. It was published in the Sydney papers, I think, in the 40s and 50s, but it needs to be a book. But hopefully one day it will turn into a book. It was at the Australian War Memorial. So, yeah, he was the first ones to land, an Australian. So they landed there unopposed, no one there. They jumped back in the boats and headed back. So they were the first troops to land, the 2nd Marines, in the Guadalcanal campaign. Now, at 8 o'clock, the 1st Marine Raiders were picked to land, and they landed at Blue Beach. Now, you may give you the reason why they landed at Blue Beach? No, so...
Yeah, so they were looking for somewhere that was unopposed, and their intelligence suggested that they would be more towards the southeast part of the island, so they were looking for somewhere where they could... And I think there was also a consideration around the amount of coral as well.
Yeah, so Vandegrift's, his whole idea, he says, look, because of the planning and everything, he wanted to try to get a one-up on the Japanese. Because this was the first amphibious landing an American had done since the Spanish-American War in the late 1898. So they said, we're going to hit them where they don't expect us. So in Tulagi, like you said, the southeast and southwest parts are the main landing beaches. So the Japanese had put their defenses on the southern part of the island, based around Hill 281. So the planners pointed to this beach. And they spoke to one of the the Australians who formerly lived there, and they said, "What about this beach? Can we land there?" And the Australian says, "If you don't care about your boats, yeah, you can land there because of the coral." And Vandergrift says, "Yeah, we don't care about our boats. Well, we want to land where they don't expect us to be." So, yeah, true to what the Australians said. When the Marines went in, first raided battalion, their boats grounded on a coral. It didn't smash the boats up. It just grounded most of them, grounded on the coral about 100 yards off. But luckily for them, it was unopposed, and they jumped out of the boats and waded ashore, and they landed without a shot being fired. They quickly started spreading out over the island.
I think the really interesting thing with this is, despite all of the difficulties in conducting amphibious operations, the one thing that you've got in your favour is the flexibility to choose the landing site. And that's why, because amphibious operations tend to be quite successful initially in making that landing. Obviously, there's examples like Dieppe which weren't successful, but it's the importance of the intelligence and to be able to land where the enemy isn't, because it's difficult to, depending on the objective. They had quite a few places where they could have landed.
Yeah, and where they're expected to land. And I don't know if I mentioned in the last episode, Vandergrift wanted to send the 1st Marine Raiders in prior to do a reconnaissance, amphibious reconnaissance. Once again, this is the first invasion, and the Navy planners hadn't. I think Twining said they're still operating on 1907 Blue Book manual, this is how we fought in 1907. And they said, no, it's too dangerous to send recon in beforehand. And I think I mentioned too that he wanted to do a night landing. And they go, no, it's too dangerous. They're more worried about their boats. But yeah, they hit them where they're not. And that was a good planning technique. And that was part of their 1934 tentative landing manual, was to use the intelligence and try to hit them where they're not, or do amphibious fights, to do demonstrations to pull them in. And we'll see that a bit later in the campaign.
So what naval gunfire and air support did the troops have as they went ashore?
Okay, so there were 3 carriers, like I mentioned before, under Fletcher. I think they were about 250, almost said yards. Geez, that was a bit of a mess. 250 miles southeast. So they provided all the CAS support, or the close air support. And then the naval support came from one cruiser, which is the San Juan. If you know about the cruisers, they're calling the anti-aircraft cruisers or the machine gun cruisers, I think, but it's the USS San Juan, which is a cruiser. And 2 destroyers was the Monson and the Buchanan. So they had three ships for close naval gunfire support. Now, the airstrikes came in initially early in the morning preceding the invasion. There's some great photos out there of the taken on the day, and it shows them striking Gavutu, Tanambogo, Tulagi. Some great photos from air shots. It shows the fires burning and docks burning, and it's some great good footage. Now, the Japanese on Tanambogo had a float plane base, as we discussed last episode. It differs. You speak to some accounts have 12, other accounts have 15 float planes. Now, the Japanese had flew the reconnaissance planes, and that was a kind of a benefit for the Americans because they came in under a cover of weather. That's allowed them to approach undetected, because the weather, I think, for the last 2 days had been pretty bad. So it allowed them to come in at darkness around 2:30 in the morning. They came in and broke up into 2 separate X-ray and yoke. But the Japanese hadn't been flying any reconnaissance planes. So early that morning, I think the weather had cleared, and they were like revving their planes up and getting them ready to go. And out of the sky come the Wildcats and shot them up and destroyed most of them. I think destroyed all of them. To this day, I think you can dive 2 or 3 off Tulagi. This is a great diving spot. People dive on those things. So it wiped out their air power off the bat on these strikes. So they're very effective from the very beginning.
So how did the fight for Tulagi go?
Well, initially, when the Marines landed, so the 1st Raider Battalion went in first, followed by the 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Rosecrans. Now, Vandergrift, because he expected a tough fight in Tulagi and the surrounding islands. When I say the surrounding islands, I mean Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. So they picked his best units. So his 1st Raider Battalion, 1st Parachute Battalion, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. So they're one of the best units they had, infantry battalions. So there were the 3 battalions, so regimental sides they were going to hit with the 2nd Marines in reserve to assist. So when the 1st Raiders hit, their job was to land and turn to the right, which is south, and spread out over the island. So 2-5, when I say 2-5, that's 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, came in behind them, and then they turned left to clear out the northern end of the island. So Raiders came in, they spread out, and they started moving down the island. You had like one company on one coast, the other company on the other coast, and two companies on that spine, that ridge spine. So they're moving down. 2-5 came in, turned left, cleared the left, the top of the island under no resistance, maybe a few sniper shots or rifle shots, they said. And then it wasn't until around midday that the Marines got their first resistance, because the Japanese had built all their resistance on around 281, which is on the far south end of the island. So the village called Sepia, there were a few, I think it was one machine gun, a few rifles there. The B Company got into a little bit of a brawl with, but they managed to push through them quite quickly. But C Company, they passed a hill called 201. Now, 201 was the home of the police superintendent and the police barracks. They've been long gone. They evacuated long before that. So the Japanese had a couple of machine gun posts up there, and that's a barbed wire over the road. So C Company, under a guy called Major Ken Bailey, pushed past Hill 201 and then started receiving fire from the rear. So they were pinned down for a short time, and then they had to assault and take those two machine gun posts out. Now, Bailey, in the process of taking them out, the company commander, he's up on one of the bunkers, pulling sandbags out. They're trying to throw grenades in this thing. He got shot in the thigh, but he continued on. And Bailey's we're going to speak about Bailey later in the campaign. But then he was wounded, and he was sent back to New Caledonia to hospital. And there he gave talks to the army there. But yeah, just keep Ken Bailey in the back of your mind, because he's back later. But he was, I think, like 6'3", bigger than life, a very aggressive commander. Now I loved him. So anyway, they continued on after that resistance. They made it almost it was getting dark then. They made it to the Cricket Oval, and they made it to the Cut. When I mentioned earlier, the Cut, which runs through the line. And I think that was their objective line. As you know, mainly objective lines are based on geographical features, so people can easily recognize it. I mean, not everyone's going to be carrying a map with a little line on it, and they go, well, the objective line is this stream or this ridge or end of the ridge or whatever. So they reached their objective line by the evening. So what they're planning on doing was going to dig in, establish a strong perimeter. And then the next day they were going to clear out the rest of the island. So that's where they were on the night of the 7th and the 8th. So the Japanese, you had roughly about 300 to 350, depends on which account you read, of Japanese there, and they were Special Naval Landing Force. This is from the 3rd Puri Special Naval Landing Force. At that stage, I think they've been redesignated the 81st or in the 84th Guard Unit, but they were Japanese Naval Infantry. You know, contrary to what you read, they weren't the most elite. They weren't Japanese Marines as like the U.S. Marines, Royal Marines were known as. They weren't as well trained as Imperial Japanese Army, but they just have this mystique about them that they were the best, most elite Japanese. And they were well trained. Don't get me wrong. And this was a reservist unit. I think the average age was in the 30s to 35 for these guys. I mean, there's a great photo. It shows the 3rd Kuri and their NCOs and officers, and they look some pretty well competent and well-determined men. But anyway, they were no business to surrender, and they were fighting quite hard. So that night, they launched 5, I don't like to use bonsai attacks. It wasn't bonsai. They're mainly the part of their Japanese doctrine for infiltration. So 5 assaults against the Marines. They'd cut one of the platoons of C Company off, but most of the attacks were beaten back quite easily. They lost a lot of the guys. So the next day, 2-5 it came in, and the plan was to reduce the Japanese. At this stage, they were in a pocket on 281. So they had some hills, they had some caves, had some sandbag positions at the bottom of the cricket oval and the cricket pitch, that area. I think a lot of these caves wasn't machine gun bunkers, because they didn't really expect an invasion. From my reading and just my theory is, I think a lot of these were air raid shelters dug into the hill, and they just threw sandbags or rocks and used them as barriers, and they just became instant bunkers, machine gun bunkers. So the fight was on for there, and they had to get these guys out of this little ravine. Now, this is the days before Marines had bazookas or flamethrowers, and they had to use a lot of improvisation. They adapted. One of the ways they adapted was they were using the TNT charges, satchel charges, and TNT blocks of TNT. They were tying them onto ropes. They would like get above the Japanese and just swing the TNT block over the entrance and try to blast them that way. They were putting them on plywood, pieces of like plywood with long sticks, and just blast them in like that way. Some of them were actually putting on ropes. Like one of the famous gunnery sergeant, he was a demolition specialist, Angus Goss. He was on a rope. He'd just, I wouldn't say abseil, when those abseil in those days, just put a rope around your waist and go down the thing, and he was throwing demolition charges in. At one stage in the cut, there was a small Japanese hole there with air raid shelter, and there's roughly about 30 to 40 Japanese in there, and had a machine gun with a sandbag. You can imagine on both sides of the cuts, the Marines were on both ends trying to fire, and you had crossfire, and they couldn't get into that cut. So one of the Marines come up with a solution. He said, there's a 50-gallon gasoline drums down by the government dock. So they rode a couple of those 50-gallon or 44 liters, talking Australian, up to the top, and they poured the fuel down, and they burned the Japanese out. And then when they ran out, they'd shoot them that way. So we used a lot of improvised techniques to make it happen. So by the end of the second day, which is the 8th, most resistance was completed, and the island was secured, even though a number of days later they had stragglers or snipers still in caves that they were trying to clean up. But the end of the second day on Tulagi, the island was secured by Rupertus, declared secured. They actually tried to bring 2 tanks in at one stage because the 2nd Marines had a company of tanks with them. The 2nd Marine Battalion, these were the M3 tanks. This is on Tulagi now, and they brought 2 in to assist, but one had a mechanical breakdown and the other one got stuck or bogged. So they wasn't involved. Now we talk about Tanambogo. They had 2 tanks and they were involved, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So yeah, that was the fight on Tulagi. Now, all the Japanese were killed except for 3, and but 45 Marines were killed fighting for that island. So this is the first time that the Americans or their allies had seen the Japanese fight defensively in caves and bunkers, and they knew we had to kill every one of them. That's why they said we had to kill every one of them to get them out. We had to go in there and kill them to get them out. This was the first real encounter of the Japanese in the defensive that was going to be seen throughout the Pacific. This is the first time that we're coming face to face with these heavy encounters. The Japanese pride themselves on offensive doctrine, but they ended up to be defensive geniuses.
One of the things that I find really interesting is, despite this being the first amphibious operation for the Marines of the war, they've got their tanks available to them. So probably a much more advanced concept of combined arms straight out of the box than we've seen with some of the other armies trying to fight in the jungle.
Yeah, well, it goes back to that tentative landing doctrine I was discussing on the last episode. And tanks were just in infancy with the infantry and learning the tank infantry tactics. The Marines hadn't worked it out. We'll see when we talk about Tanambogo and the first tank attack, unsupported by infantry, and what could go wrong there. There was a lot to be learned. But yeah, they had them there, and they had a whole tank battalion with a division of M3s, and had some M2s too, which is the only time they were used in combat. But they had M3 Stuarts and M2s, light tanks.
So while we've got the landing going on at Tulagi, we've also got operations going on with Gavutu and Tanambogo. Do you want to sort of talk us through what those 2 islands are like and what the terrain's like?
Okay, well, we'll talk about what they were like beforehand and how they became known and why the Japanese landed there. I think I mentioned too in the last episode how the Australians were there at Tanambogo. Did we mention that? I think at a seaplane base.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. So the Australians had a seaplane base. Japanese took it over. So Tanambogo was the main seaplane base, and the Gavutu was used also. So pre-war, Gavutu was the headquarters of the Lever Brothers, and the Lever Brothers was a big coconut plantation. I think they're still in business. I don't know, but they were the coconut plantations that owned business that owned all the coconut plantations in the area. So that was their main headquarters on Gavutu. So Gavutu was clear. There was no jungle there. They had buildings, had their big store, had headquarter buildings. It was nice and clear, had coconut trees on it. It was a nice place too. Had their loading docks, big concrete piers, docks. The Japanese had had their seaplane docks there and seaplane establishments. So Gavutu is small. I mean, both of them are very small. They're basically just juts of coral popping up out of the ocean. So Gavutu is about 500 to 600 yards long, about 300 250, 300 yards wide. Depends on where you measure it from. Has one hill on it. That's hill 148, and that's right there. Now, Gavutu is separated by Tanambogo. They're separated by a causeway. There's about 300 yards between both islands. So pre-war, what the Australians have done and the Lever brothers have done, they put a causeway there. The causeway is about a roadside size width, 300 yards long. They could go from island to island to drive vehicles back and forth and move material. So there's a causeway. You could just walk from one island to the other, about 300 yards long. So that was separated by that. And the causeway is built over just a coral ledge. So Tanambogo was even tinier. So it's about 250 yards by 250 yards. It was clear too, and it had warehouses on it and cranes and all this stuff that involved in a seaplane base. And it had a small hill called 121, so 121 feet. So these two hills are going to be very prevalent when the Marines try to land there, because both those hills can support each other. So we're only talking 1,000 yards apart, if that, 800 yards apart, these two hills. So you got 148, 121, and they're separated by 800 yards. So that's what the terrain looked like. Very open, very built up, actually, with buildings.
So the seaplane base was at Gavutu and Tanambogo. Gavutu was assaulted by the US Marine 1st Parachute Battalion at 1200. This was after the landings at Guadalcanal and Tulagi, because there wasn't enough air cover to support 3 landings at once. How did the Gavutu landings go?
Yeah, so I can probably say it in one sentence, but it was the first by the Americans in World War II. So go back to those two hills. The Americans expected to be about 200 Japanese on those islands. Their intelligence said there's 1,500 Japanese on all the Tulagi and surrounding islands. They roughly said, look, there's roughly 200 to 250 on Tanambogo and Gavutu. The Japanese on Tanambogo and Gavutu consisted of the Yokohama Air Group, which is the float planes, which you're talking about the pilots, the air crews, the aircraft maintenance staff, and things like that. And then you had the 14th Construction Unit, mainly Koreans, laborers, and some Japanese engineers and some Japanese civilians were in there too. You had one platoon of, quote, fighters, and that was a Special Naval Landing Force platoon from Tulagi. The rest of them were just support personnel. There were about 500 to 600 of them there on both those islands. But what they had was, they weren't expecting a direct amphibious assault. They didn't have bunkers set up and pillboxes and barbed wire. What they did have was a lot of anti-aircraft weapons, machine guns, because that was what they expected to get hit by. Because Americans had been doing raids. There's B-17s, especially on Guadalcanal. So first Parachute Battalion obviously was an elite unit of the Marine Corps. There's a bit of debate, but in my opinion, they're better trained and of a higher caliber than the Raiders. The 1st Parachute Battalion, majority of them were pre-war regulars, especially the NCOs and officers, and they had the pick of the NCOs and officers. You had a very, very good unit. So obviously they wouldn't come in by plane on this one, they'd come in by amphibious assault. They didn't expect much resistance on Gavutu. So what Vandergrift had planned to do with Gavutu, they're going to land on Gavutu, secure it, and then potentially, because they had a whole battalion of artillery from the 10th Marines, which is attached to the 2nd Marines, they're going to land at least a battery of 75 millimeters there and provide support to Tulagi. There's only 3,000 yards from Tulagi. So Gavutu and Tanambogo is 3,000 yards east of Tulagi. So they were going to use that to support. They didn't expect much resistance. So the pre-landing bombardments, the Marines had planned to land a seaplane dock. But when the carrier planes came in, it blasted that seaplane dock, threw concrete everywhere. So that was off the charts or off the table. So they had to land at a small beach, about 100 yards wide, if that, not even 100 yards, at 50 yards wide, to the left of the dock. And plus they had to land at a big concrete loading dock that was pre-war, Lever Brothers. So the first boats came in, they automatically started taking fire from both of those hills, enfiladed, heavy machine gun fire. And guys were, killed and wounded in their boats before they even got out. There was one interesting point. You remember I said about the float planes, how the carrier planes come and sunk all the float planes? One Marine account was when they're heading in, one of the float planes was still, quote, floating, is in pieces, and sitting on the wing. They said it was a pilot, so I don't know how they knew it was a pilot, but it's definitely a Japanese there with his pistol out, firing at them. All these Marine landing craft were coming in with all these, hundreds of Marines coming in. This one Japanese just defiantly firing his pistol. And he didn't last long because the guy on the one of the landing craft had the Lewis gun, and he cut him down. But just the defiance of that Japanese. But anyway, they came in, started getting hit, and then they were almost going to get pushed back. So they managed to land a couple of machine guns. They started throwing fire on 148, and they had enough suppressant fire so they could land more guys on there. They were taking heavy casualties. The battalion commander was hit, wasn't killed, but he was or knocked out, very seriously wounded. They managed by the end of the day to take Hill 148 with a lot of casualties. And then at the end of the day, Tanambogo was still in Japanese hands. And when it was getting dusk, they made a decision that B Company, 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, the guys that landed at Haleyton at 7:40 in the morning, they put them in 5 landing craft when it was getting dusk. They said, we'll make an amphibious assault straight on Tanambogo. Well, one of their airplanes, CAS, came in and hit a fuel dump there and just lit the place up. So these guys were lit up when they came in, and the Japanese just pounded them with machine gun fire and turned them back. So that amphibious assault was turned back. So at the end of the day, on the end of the 7th, Gavutu was in Marine hands after heavy casualties. I'm trying to think how many of the parachute. They lost quite a bit of guys. I forgot it. Let me just find it. Yeah, they had 30 killed and 54 wounded. Now, you got to remember, the parachute battalion was only, I want to say, about 400 guys. They weren't they were half the strength of an infantry battalion. Yeah, they're about, I think, 400 that landed. So initially they said one out of, they lost 50%. That was the reports coming into the division, and 50% casualties, or 6% casualties. About 1 every 10, they reckon, was hit, suffered casualties. So they such a waste of some good infantry or good Marines. But they took it, and then end of the day, they still had Tanambogo to take. So that puts us up the next morning to Tanambogo. So,
yeah, what was the plan then to seize Tanambogo?
Well, at this stage, the 2nd Marines hadn't got back in their boats and headed to Santa Cruz Islands because Vandegrift appealed to, didn't appeal, he just told flat out through Rupertus. They're in contact. He told Rupertus, he goes, look, Rupertus says, I need more troops. I don't have any troops to take Tanambogo. It's more heavy resistance than we thought. So Vandegrift then went to Turner, the amphibious force commander, and said, we need the 2nd Marines to help us. He said, okay. So they released the 3rd Battalion, the 2nd Marines, to assist in the taking of Tanambogo. So the plan was they were going to use the parachute battalion to provide supporting fire from Gavutu, because they had 148 in their possession. One company was going to be on the causeway, and another company was going to land amphibious assault, supported by 2 light tanks, M3 tanks from the 2nd Tank Battalion. That was the plan. They were going to proceed with CAS support. That takes me back, too. I'll talk about some of the close air support on the first day that was happening, because this is very, very important. When they were taking Hill 148, they called for air support, and 2 Dauntless bombers came in and dropped 2 bombs 2 separate times and killed a number of Marines. I think killed 4 Marines. And from then on, they said no more air support because it's just too small of an island and we can't risk it. So from then on, there's no more air support. There was some naval gun support for, I think, a destroyer. So that was the plan. So the next day, the base of fire came from Gavutu, straight on Tanambogo. They landed. The 2 tanks came in. One went left, one went right. They were kind of channelized them, because if you look at the photos at the time, the naval bombardment had hit some of the warehouses and there was just stuff everywhere. So they had to go through drums and cranes and broken equipment. And they outran their infantry support. And they got to the base of Hill 121. And a lot of these Japanese, like I said before, they were construction workers. They weren't armed. So they came out with knives and picks and sticks and spears or whatever they can. And one tank, commanded by Lieutenant Sweeney, had went close to 121. They said about the eyewitness accounts that 30 to 40 Japanese come straight out of the hill and surrounded with Molotov cocktails and sticks. And they killed Sweeney with a rifle shot. And then they started dragging the crewman out. They were burning the tank, dragging one crewman out. And they cut him up and beat him up. He miraculously lived. He played dead. He lived, tale to tale. Quite a harrowing account if you read it. The driver managed to put it in reverse and get out because it was stuck on a stump initially. That's what caused the Japanese to run out. And he made it back to the medical The other tank had provided fire as best as it could, but then it pulled back too. By that stage, one company, the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, had charged across the causeway and established a foothold in junction to the other company had landed, and both of those companies swept through, and they basically took out the island. And what they were doing on Tulagi were using some of the innovative tactics, like pouring gasoline in caves and using demolition charges. They were doing the same on both of these islands too, especially Gavutu. They in Tanambogo, they were sealing them in the caves. They'd just hear them down in the caves and they'd just blow the cave entrance, like you've seen later in some of the later campaigns, like Iwo Jima and Peleliu. They just seal them in there, and to this day, there's some Japanese still there, sealed in those caves. I think the Japanese come and try to cover them as best they could, but there still remains there.
So some very tough fighting, and as you said, we're seeing the Japanese, what their way of fighting on the defense, and it's in many respects just as harrowing as their offensive capabilities, isn't it?
Yes, because once again, you've got to literally kill every one of them to get them out of there, and they can be sick and wounded, or like we've seen here, they could just be civilians and construction workers with no training. Doesn't take much training to, I think, like Patton said, to pull a trigger on a machine gun. That's all you have to do, and if you're not going to surrender. And then in those days, the Marines didn't have the blows, torch, and corkscrew techniques they developed later in the war. And we talk about in January 43, when we get to that point, we talk about when the Marines are starting to use some of them with innovative, but they've had to come up with a lot of innovative techniques and think off the fly and off the cuff what's going to work. Fire seemed to be the biggest way to get them out, but once again, you don't have flamethrowers. They didn't come around to January 15th on Guadalcanal, so pour fuel down there and try to blast them out as best you can. And put TNT blocks, they were doing that, putting TNT blocks in fuel drums, rolling them up to cave entrance and just blasting them, just using what they know.
Once again, though, we're seeing the use of artillery. So even in this first, it's a really comprehensive approach to combined arms, which many of the armies that we've been looking at in the way that they've been fighting the Japanese. And so at this time, we've got the Kokoda campaign about to start, and yet the Australian troops would be fighting without air cover, without any artillery until almost the end, or the peak of the Japanese advance. And so a much more well-rounded approach towards combined arms, which significantly makes things a lot better. And we'll see a lot more about the artillery when we move across the Guadalcanal, won't we?
Yes. And I was speaking to an Australian historian, and he was mentioning the biggest thing, I guess, difference between especially Kokoda, Papua campaign and Guadalcanal is artillery. Artillery made the big force multiplier. Yeah. And the Marines had a lot of artillery. They brought a lot of artillery with them. And you will say when we hit Guadalcanal, they had one battery up and firing within 4 hours after landing. Over 75 pack howitzers.
Yeah, the point about artillery on the Kokoda campaign is very interesting because the Japanese had artillery and they put a significant amount of their logistics effort, and the Kokoda campaign was a logistics campaign because of the difficulties in just getting everything forward to where the fighting was. They put a significant amount of effort into moving guns and artillery ammunition. So they were able to outrange the Australian troops often, which would have been quite demoralising.
Yeah, I've got some figures here for the landing on Tulagi, surrounding islands for the Americans. They all up there, 145 killed and 194 wounded. The Japanese, they lost, I think they had 15 prisoners on Gavutu and Tanambogo, 3 on Tulagi. That's 70. That's approximately 70. As you know, these figures are not dead on. That has swam or escaped to the nearby Florida islands. And the 2nd Marines and some of the raiders spent for the next weeks and months chasing these guys in the Florida islands. So it was a taste of what was the expect is going to be in the heavy fighting that's going to be coming.
Yep. We'll leave it there. We'll return next week with our look at the landings on Guadalcanal. And keep an eye out for Dave's book, Guadalcanal's Longest Fight, The Pivotal Battles of the Matanikaw Front.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.principlesofwar.com. theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos, and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.